Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jamie Singletary, and I am the Director of Alumni and Family Programming at Within. And I am delighted to be able to introduce our next two presenters, my colleague, Kate Scafati, who is a clinical lead here at Within, and Schuyler Bailar, Schuyler Bailar, who is on our advisory board. And today they are going to be discussing gender identity and expression, societal expectations, and the impacts on self-image. I will turn it over to Schuyler and Kate, and please utilize our chat feature to our attendees if you have questions, and don't forget to view your CEGO dashboard to get your evaluation for this presentation along with your CE certificate. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. I'm super excited to be here today. I'm actually going to start with a little request. I would love, and I think I'm going to speak for Kate and Ramon, we would love to be able to see your faces. So if you are able to turn your cameras on, we welcome it, we invite it. I encourage it. I think not only is it lovely for us to be able to see who we're talking to instead of sort of staring into a black screen for an hour and a half, it's also about your accountability, right? It's about you being present and being here with us in this space to learn about these important issues, important intersections. So I do strongly encourage you turn your camera on. I appreciate the folks that have already. Thank you so much. Lovely to see you. If you're not in a place where you can do it right this moment, but you can later, that's awesome too. We just greatly appreciate it. So thank you so much. Wonderful. I love awesome. I love seeing everybody's faces. Cool. All right. So we are going to be talking, like Jamie was saying, I'm going to share my screen, about gender identity and body image specifically, how societal expectations can also impact both of these, and of course, how they relate to eating disorders. But before we hop in, I would love for Kate to introduce herself. I'll introduce myself, and then we're gonna roll from there.
Thanks so much, Schuyler. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you to Jamie and to Within for hosting the summit and having us and having these important conversations. My name is Kate Scafati. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a clinical lead at Within. And I also just wanted to acknowledge as we get started that I am a cisgender person with cisgender privilege. And even though I work with trans clients, I don't assume that I'm in a place to understand the daily lived experience of what it's like to be trans. But I'm excited to be here and talk to you about my experience and our work in creating affirming spaces for trans clients.
Excellent.
Back to you, Schuyler.
Thanks so much, Kate. And thanks for that note about also where you're coming from. And I think it's an important note for all of us to just take a moment and recognize where we are all come from, right? So as I introduce myself, I'm going to give you a little bit of a longer introduction about who I am and where I come from in a moment. I encourage you to think about your identities and where you come from and what you do and what you don't understand about experiences of trans, gender nonconforming, and non-binary folks, because I think interrogating ourselves is actually a really important part of being the best providers that we can. All right, so I'm going to give you a little overview of what we're doing. Like I said, and like Jamie said, we're exploring the impacts of societal expectations on gender identity, body image in trans individuals, specifically with eating disorders. I'm Schuyler. I use he, him pronouns. You just heard from Kate, who uses she, her pronouns. The overview of today is we're going to start with a sort of, I always call it humanization, but we're going to start with a little bit about my background and who I am. I think it's really important when we talk about trans people to remember that they're people, and the best way to do that is to hear a story. So we're gonna start with that. We're going to do a little terminology overview, and I'll just recommend to everybody, if you could just mute yourselves while unless you're talking, that would be fantastic, just because otherwise we hear background noise, and sometimes that's difficult on Zoom. Sorry, we'll continue forward. So terminology, we'll talk about gender dysphoria and body image specifically with regards to dysphoria, clinical implications. We'll talk about treatment implications, and Kate's going to go over those, and then we'll have time for questions. And my goal is to have as much time for questions as possible, because I think that's where we can really learn the most. Great, we're going to enter into that. All right, so like I said, I wanted to start where I started, which is as a little baby. So like most of you, started as a little tiny tyke, big cheeks. There's nothing in my mouth. They call me Chubs for a reason. Most important part of this photo I want to share, I've been a swimmer my entire life. I learned how to swim around the same time I learned how to walk. And that has always been a...
nice to meet you.
Hey folks, Mackenzie, it would be great if you could meet yourself. And anybody else coming in, please, if you would take a moment just to mute yourself while we're not, if you're not talking. So thank you so much. So like I said, been swimming my whole life. I learned how to swim around 10 months old. I always joke when I'm like on an actual physical stage, if I trip or fall, you'll know I'm not much of a land animal, which is very true. I spent most of my life growing up in the water. I got good at swimming around the age of fourth grade. So that's about 9 or 10. Not particularly good. This is a 16th place plaque. So I wasn't winning anything just yet. Far more concerned with those super cool glasses that I was wearing. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they're the kinds that when you go outside, they turn into sunglasses, which I thought was wicked cool. This is also like the Justin Bieber, like shaggy haircut style, which was not in at the time, but I pretended it was. This is another one of my strange hairstyles. This is fourth grade when I decided I was a punk rock star, and I thought punk rock stars all had mohawks. So that's what this was. I want to point out the mohawk is made out of Elmer's glue. Yeah, real Elmer's glue. And it was a kind that was like glittery, sparkly, had all these little golden stars in it. So if you looked really closely, it was a bit of a star-spangled mohawk, which is super punk rock, if you ask me. I have a younger brother. His name is Jinwan. This is him in the water mohawk. No Elmer's glue here, much to my mother's relief. He's 2 years younger than me, but he's 6'4" and about 250 some odd pounds. He's a big boy. He's a very big boy. So he's always been, despite the fact that he's younger than me, always been the one to carry me around. That's him in the orange. We grew up doing everything together, wearing fun hats and fun shoes, going hiking, getting money together. We were inseparable as kids. Water sports, again, a really big part of my life, whether actually being in the water or screaming and jumping into the water. No idea what I was trying to accomplish in these photos, but I was 9. I had fun doing it. Not much else mattered. This is a yoga pose I've done pretty much everywhere I've traveled growing up. And when I began traveling to do speeches, I would do this on stage every once in a while. It's not much space to do it here in my office, but I also wanted to point out these pants. Maybe you've seen them before. Maybe you're also cool enough to have them. These are khaki pants. They zip off in the middle and they become shorts. And I thought that was super cool. And it would like take off half my pant leg in English class or something. And my teacher would be like, well, what are you doing? I don't know what I was doing, but I thought it was fun that they could zip off. Skateboarded and rollerbladed a lot as a kid as well, but you might notice that I'm wearing literally every type of padding known to man, including underneath my cargo shorts. There are also butt pads. Those would be courtesy of my mother, who thought that I was going to break my butt. And so butt pads it was. It worked. I never broke my butt. When I got to high school, though, for me, a lot of things changed. And the number one thing that shifted was I decided I needed to fit in. And for me, fitting in meant looking like a girl. All right. So when I was born, I was assigned female at birth. That means everybody said, okay, this is a girl and you're a girl. And I said, okay, I guess I'm a girl. But I never really acted or presented like the other girls did. I didn't feel like what they seemed to feel like. And for most of my childhood, that was okay. I wore what, as you saw in those photos and sort of how I presented myself, was very stereotypically masculine or boyish. I wore boys' clothes. I played with the boys. I played boys' baseball, boys' soccer, boys' lacrosse. And for my childhood, a lot of that was okay. But a lot of it was very hard. I was bullied pretty constantly for not being girl enough. And the girls at my school would make fun of me. They would say I wasn't a real girl, and so I couldn't play with them. The boys would say, well, you're not a real boy, so you can't play with us. So I got stuck in between. And I think for a lot of folks, middle school is a difficult time, socially especially. But for me, there was this added layer of gender. Never girl enough, never boy enough, always something in between, and never quite enough. Bathrooms were the most stressful part of my middle school experience. I used the girls' bathroom as I was told I had to. I didn't even consider there was another option. But I was bullied, yelled at, harassed, and thrown out of most girls' bathrooms that I ever entered. The girls in there would be like, what are you doing in here? This is the girls' bathroom. You look like a boy, get out. And most of them knew that I was, technically, quote, supposed to be in that bathroom, but they would treat me that way anyways because I looked different. So I would run from one end of the school to the other end to find the single stalled adult only bathroom. It always had a big sign on it that said adult only or teachers only. But I figured that it was better to risk getting in trouble for using the teacher's bathroom than it was to get yelled at by all the girls in my grade. So I did that for years. But when I got to high school, sick and tired of being afraid to use the bathroom, of being afraid of other people in gendered moments. And I thought, you know what can I do to fit in? What can I do to stop getting thrown out of the bathroom? I thought maybe if I look like this stereotype of a woman, this woman everybody says that I am, maybe it will be okay. Maybe I'll fit in. So I grew my hair out long. I stopped cutting it short. I began wearing more girls' clothes, or clothes from the women's section. I thought that girls were supposed to wear makeup, so I did twice. I wore high heels also twice, the same 2 times. But I looked apart. So this is me in high school. On the left with my skateboard still, of course, and on the right, one of the first times I was wearing makeup. At the time in high school, I was getting a 4.0 GPA. I was getting recruited to swim by Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Columbia, and Princeton. We were making national records on my swim team at the time. I was swimming faster than I'd ever swum before. I got my Harvard acceptance letter. I was all set and ready to swim at my dream school the following year. I actually had come out as gay. I knew I liked girls, and I thought, okay, maybe that's the thing that's different about me. Maybe that's why I feel so not like myself. Maybe if I come out, it will be okay. So I had come out. I was dating a girl that I liked at the time. Everything seemed to be going for me. But for most of high school, and especially in these photos that I'm showing you now, I was miserable. I felt so sad, so lost, so disconnected from myself all the time. And actually, instead of taking a break to figure out what that meant to me, I thought, you know what? I'm getting all these gold medals, and I'm getting all these good grades and acceptance letters. What does it matter if I'm miserable? But of course, it did matter. And over time, my mental health began to suffer. And about halfway through my high school career, I broke my back. In a biking accident, I fractured 3 vertebrae, and that took from me my number one vice, my number one passion and pastime, swimming. So for an extra 20 hours a week that I was usually under the water training, now I was doing nothing. And it was in that emptiness that my mental health deteriorated. And most especially, I began struggling pretty severely with an eating disorder. At that time, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I needed help. And so somehow a couple sort of months into me struggling pretty severely, I reached out for help. And I had parents who were supportive enough to say, we need to get you to therapy. And they both financially could support that. So that was a privilege. And also they ideologically said, yes, we support therapy, because there's a lot of people that don't have that privilege. So luckily I was able to access therapy. But over the next couple of years, so my junior and my senior year in high school, I actually didn't get much better. There's a number of reasons for that, and we can go into that later if people are curious. But I think the summary is that I didn't have a provider that understood me, and I also didn't dedicate the time I needed to do therapy. I was too busy doing everything else, and nobody had taught me to prioritize my mental health. So actually, by the time I ended my high school career, I was still pretty sick, and I needed more help. So the therapist I was seeing at the time said, take a gap year before you go to Harvard. You need a year to figure out your mental health and go to residential treatment. Though that felt like fracturing everything I felt like I had worked for, pausing my entire life, having to tell people about my mental health, including my coaches at Harvard, which felt terrifying, I thought, you know what? I don't know what else to do. And so I took that gap year. I went to a place in Miami, Florida called the Oliver Pyatt Treatment Centers. Many of you probably have heard of this place, one of the Montanito centers. And I spent 131 days at this place. That's about 5 months. And it's the first place in my life that had me slow down, come to a stop. It said, Schuyler, who are you? And in that pause, I was finally able to discover and then say, I am transgender. And initially that came with a lot of relief. It explained a lot about my childhood, a lot about why I never quite fit in, a lot about why gender and bathrooms and locker rooms had been so painful and difficult for me. But you also have to remember that I am an athlete, and I was recruited to swim for Harvard women's swim team. You all probably know this, but gender is really important in sports, especially in swimming. There isn't any kind of gender neutral uniform or sort of like co-ed team. It's a tiny little men's Speedo or a one-piece women's suit. The gender boxes are very clear. So when I figured out that I am transgender, I was actually terrified that I was going to then lose my sport. Now, I'm going to fast forward over the next several months of this process because it's not quite as relevant to conversation about eating disorders. But essentially what happened over those months is as I developed what I wanted to do with my identity, with disclosing it, with swimming, and alongside my coaches at Harvard, who were very surprisingly accepting, who offered me a spot on the men's team. It took me a long time and a lot of thinking. Here's me thinking. You might notice that my glasses have turned into sunglasses. They too have transitioned, but anyway, all puns aside. I thought a lot about this and ended up deciding that I needed to take a risk for my own happiness. I had been risking my happiness for success. And in this situation, I needed to do the opposite and risk that success and what that success looked like for my happiness and my alignment. So about after probably several months of me deciding what to do with swimming, I decided to swim for the men's team. And I became the first openly transgender athlete to compete for a Division I men's team in college. And I spent all 4 years on that team, the only trans athlete to have done so for all 4 years. And that's something that I've spent a lot of time sharing my journey for. And today, the reason I start with this story, I know it's a little bit long, is because I think it's really important that we situate our stories, especially as trans people, especially as a trans person who had an eating disorder, especially as a trans person who had an eating disorder who also is an athlete. I think it's important we remember that we are people with a lot of experiences, with a lot of things you might be even able to relate to. So as I was talking, maybe you also felt like you were disconnected in middle school. Maybe you also struggled with whether or not to continue a passion of yours or to share a part of yourself. And those things might have felt conflicting. So I hope you sort of can follow along in that journey with me. I'm in the middle, by the way, in this photo with the bucket in my hands. And this is the rest of my team, my last year in college. So that's my background. That's where I'm coming from. And what I really want to do now that we've gone through some history of me is to actually now give you the language. We're going to roll into what gender means and body image and dysphoria and all of these sort of bigger topics with regards to trans people, but it's really difficult to have difficult conversations if we don't even know the right language, right? It's very difficult to respect people if we don't have the most respectful language. So that's where we're going to start. The first word is transgender, which you may have already heard. Hopefully you have, given that I've said it a couple of times. But most people don't actually know the definition. So we're going to go through that. Transgender is somebody or describes somebody who does not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. So when you're born, you get a birth certificate, right? It says M or F on it. If you don't identify as what was put there at birth, that makes you transgender. If you do identify with what was put there at birth, that makes you cisgender. You might notice that Kate used that word when she was describing herself. That word is cisgender, right? So that describes somebody who does identify as the gender they were assigned at birth. It's really important to recognize both of these words are adjectives, okay? So we use them to describe a noun. It's not about the grammar. It's that if you use them incorrectly, you're likely going to imply something wrong and also likely negative about the person. So people will say, oh, Schuyler is a transgender. A transgender what? A transgender person, a transgender man, a transgender speaker. But when we remove speaker, man, person, then we dehumanize me. And I become just a label, and often a label that has a lot of negative sensation about it, right? So we need to use it as an adjective. Schuyler is transgender, or Schuyler is a transgender man, right? People also say Schuyler's transgendered. They'll also use the word cisgendered. It's important to recognize that both of these, A, do not exist because we do not add ed to the end of an adjective, but it also implies that something happened to me to make me transgender, or that something happened to you to make you not transgender, right? Nothing happened to me to make me trans. Nothing happened to somebody else to make them not trans. I just am trans, right? You just are, or somebody just is cisgender, right? So we don't have those eds at the end. The last way people will incorrectly use transgender is, let's say Schuyler transgendered 8 years ago. Schuyler did not transgender 8 years ago. Schuyler transitioned 8 years ago, okay? So transgender is the identity. There's no act required in order to be transgender. One just is transgender, the same way that I am Korean. I'm half Korean and I'm not Korean. Nothing made me Korean. I just am, right? So the act that sometimes is associated with trans people is transition, right? Transition is any step or steps a person takes to affirm their gender identity, and there is no one way to transition. There's not this prescribed list of things that a person has to do in order to transition. And I think it's really important that we understand we don't use the terms the transition, the full transition, the complete transition, because that implies that you know what that looks like for somebody else, and that there is a sort of linear version of the complete transition. I'll also venture to remind you that when people ask me, so Schuyler, have you gotten the full transition? What are they really asking me? They're asking me what's in my pants. For many reasons, that's not the most appropriate question to ask. If you are a provider, it's definitely an inappropriate question to ask. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that we don't really ask anybody about their genitals without that explicit invitation to do so. Now, if we want to have those conversations here and we want to talk deeply about that, I actually give you the explicit consent for us to have those conversations because we're in a learning environment in which I feel comfortable talking about those kinds of things. But please don't ask random people about that, especially not your clients. All right. Continuing with these, gender identity, sex or biological sex, and gender expression. So a lot of people conflate these. They make them exactly the same thing, and they are not exactly the same thing. So let's break them down. Gender identity, an arrow pointing inwards, who I am. It is my internal sense of my own gender, a complex biopsychosocial relationship between body, identity, sociality, and it's very complicated. There's actually not, I would say, in my understanding, great research about what exactly gender identity is and where it comes from, though we do know that kids can develop their gender identity as young as 3 or 4 years old. Sex, biological sex, gender identity does not have to match that, right? Biological sex usually refers to what somebody was assigned at birth, right? So for me, female, but the term is very misleading because it kind of implies that there's one way to define biological sex, that biological sex is binary, right? These are either female or male, and that it's simple, but the reality is it's not. Biological sex has 5 major components and they can come together in a variety of different ways and not often or not always in a linear way. So biological sex is neither simple nor binary, and it's really important to recognize that. If you do need to ask for somebody's legal gender marker, then I would say that, legal gender marker. If you want to talk about what somebody was assigned at birth or designated at birth, then you can say that. But biological sex is a pretty unclear term, and I think can evoke a lot of transphobia in a lot of ways. Gender expression, this is how we communicate our gender, right? And it is 100% bound by social construct, right? It's what society has deemed as of a man or of a woman as masculine and feminine. For example, today I'm wearing a button down and a tie. Most people consider that masculine attire. But if I were to change my clothes and let's say put on a dress, something people consider more feminine attire, I don't become a woman. I would be me, myself, a man, wearing something people consider feminine, right? So social constructs, they also change over time, over geographic location, culture, and so on, right? So that's another sort of example of how they're socially bound. All right, just a few more. We're going to hopefully speed through these, but these are ones for you to just have in your brain. Gender nonconforming, you might have heard me say that or others say that. It's a massive umbrella term that means pretty much anybody who doesn't fit societal norms of gender expression, gender identity. Right? Non-binary, something that's beneath that, and that's somebody whose gender identity does not identify within that binary, right? And the binary meaning that there's only 2 genders of male and female, and non-binary can mean different things to different people. Sometimes it means a combination of genders, sometimes it means no gender, agender. Some people feel a kind of a combination of like male and female. Sometimes people just feel like the absence of gender altogether. There's a lot of different ways people describe this, and if it's relevant and if your client has consent, I would allow them to explain what it means to them, but only if they feel comfortable. All right, transmasculine, transfeminine. Transmasculine is a bigger umbrella term to describe anybody who's assigned female at birth who doesn't identify as female. So that would be me. I'm a transmasculine person. I'm also a transgender man, but not all transmasculine individuals are trans men, right? There's some that don't identify as men, but are on that spectrum, right? Same with transfeminine, but the opposite, right? GAHT or HRT, you've probably more commonly heard HRT, hormone replacement therapy, but we also call it gender affirming hormone therapy, right? These are things like testosterone or estrogen or what's considered cross hormones, right? So the hormone that would not be natally produced during puberty, and that is considered the cross hormone. Right, top surgery up here, so breast augmentation or mastectomy. Bottom surgery is genital affirmation surgery, right? So, or gender affirmation surgery on the genitals. You might have heard the term sex change or sex reassignment surgery. Those are both quite outdated for that last term, bottom surgery, because we're not actually reassigning somebody's gender when we give them surgery. We are often offering affirmation, right, or confirmation. So that's why we call them gender affirming surgeries, not gender reassignment surgeries. And this is important as well. Another way to think about it, when I got top surgery on my chest, and when I got top surgery, I didn't become a man. I've always been myself, but that surgery was gender affirming to me. All right. Now, Take a big breath. There's a lot of terms. I'll encourage you to check out the website on the bottom here, pinkmanare.com/terminology. All the terms I just mentioned are there, including many more. And so if you need to review them, you can visit that link at the bottom again, pinkmanare.com/terminology. But now we're gonna really talk about gender for a moment. So we already learned that gender is this complex, biopsychosocial concept. Most people, when they say gender, refer to a combo of gender identity, gender expression, gender roles, or just one of them. So I encourage you to be specific when you're talking about what you mean when you say gender. Gender identity specifically would be the internal sense of one's own gender, right? Gender expression, the communication, as you just learned. And then lastly, gender roles are the boxes, right, that we put into gender expression. So this is how a man needs to act. This is how a woman needs to act. This is what a man looks like. This is what a woman looks like. That's what the gender role is. And these are the things that really can constrain all people, but especially trans people. Okay, so this is sort of a little way that I've thought about this and how specifically gender and gender standards, gender role standards impact trans people. So consider this, everyone, including cis people, right? So people who are not trans, are subject to gender standards and the gender binary, irrespective of their gender history, right? So for cisgender folks, people who are not trans, societal gender standards can contribute to body distortions, right? Or pressure on body, which contributes to increased ED risk, right? For trans people, we have this enormous extra layer. Due to the systemic oppression and transphobia that exists to deny us our identities, right? I walk the world constantly being told by people that I'm not a real man because I'm trans, right? We must fight to claim the gender and the validity of the gender in the first place. So a cis man might want to prove that he's man enough. I feel I have to prove that I am man enough to prove that I'm man enough. There's this other layer of that, right? Many trans people feel that if we are not the ideal man or woman, that will not be recognized as ourselves. So this is heightened gender pressure in this sense, because not only are we denied sort of worthiness in that sense, but we might also be denied our gender altogether if we don't fit that stereotype. Right? So for trans folks, societal gender standards and systemic oppression and the internal struggle, right? So that's called dysphoria, which we're going to come back to in a moment, can contribute to those body distortions and then heightened ED risk. Okay, so another sort of factor there. Okay, now we're going to talk about the dysphoria specifically. So if you don't know what the word dysphoria means, it just means general discomfort if you look at the Latin roots. But gender dysphoria is the distress or discomfort that arises from the incongruence of one's assigned gender and one's gender identity. So for me, I was assigned female. I identify as male. That incongruence can provide distress for an individual. Varying degrees. Some people don't experience dysphoria. Some people do. I would say probably the majority of people who are trans do experience this dysphoria, though some people might not. And varying degrees of intensity, right? For some people, it feels like life or death. Like if I don't fix this, I don't know if I can stick around. For some people, it might not be as intense, right? But all of it should be taken seriously. So for me, again, that gender dysphoria was pretty intense. I would say that it concentrated a lot on my chest. So having top surgery was massively helpful for me because I felt a lot of relief afterwards. Gender dysphoria is in the DSM, right? So it's in the DSM-5. It's also in the updated DSM. And it calls it a mental disorder. The most important part to recognize here, though, is that gender dysphoria does not mean, or gender dysphoria being in the DSM does not mean transness is a disorder, right? Being transgender is not a mental illness, but the dysphoria, the gender dysphoria that some of us experience, that can cause clinically significant distress and therefore is a mental disorder or can be, right? Older versions of the DSM had gender identity disorder in the DSM, which actually pathologized being transgender. Gender identity was the disorder. Transsexualism used to be in there before that, and that also pathologized being transgender. It's one of the reasons that a number of people might not like the word transsexual because it brings forth a sort of pathologizing history of our identities, right? So again, the sort of main takeaway point is being transgender is not an illness, but sometimes we experience distress that can be clinically significant. When we treat gender dysphoria, we do not actually try, and all of the major medical, psychological, and psychiatric associations agree with this, we don't actually try to treat transness, right? We treat the dysphoria, which means we affirm gender identity. Right? So we don't try to force me to be a woman in order to treat the gender dysphoria, which people did in the past, but we either actually aim to validate the true gender identity, my masculinity, my manhood, if you will. And that's part of treating it, okay? Now, This is key, especially when we thinking about eating disorders. Body image distortions, body image issues, body dysmorphia are not the same thing as gender dysphoria. So let's break this down. The words sound very similar, right? Gender dysphoria, though, and gender dysmorphia. And it's really key that we don't conflate the two because they're not the exact same thing, right? So the root of gender dysphoria is identity, right? There is an incongruence of identity. It's not that, let's just sort of simple example with my breasts. I used to have breasts. I felt very disconnected from those. The root of that dysphoria, that distress that it provided me was not, I don't like them necessarily, is they don't fit me. They don't feel congruent or aligned with who I am. Body dysmorphia is actually rooted in more dislike perhaps, but is actually deeper root usually, right, of self-worth or lack thereof, and an intent to control one's life, or lack thereof, right? So these are very different roots. I don't feel gender dysphoric because I don't have control over my life, or because I have, less self-worth. It might cause that down the road, but actually the core is this misalignment of identity, and that's a really different core, right? The population affected for gender dysphoria, transgender individuals, and body dysmorphia, usually that affects actually body dysmorphic disorder, those who have BDD, and some overlap with eating disorders. Of course, it's not just BDD, but that's a high proportion of it. I share this because a lot of people actually will talk about body dysmorphia within eating disorders, just sort of blanket as if talking about body distortions, and it's not exactly the same thing. And I think it's important for us to recognize that. Lastly, and this is actually the reason it's really important to know the difference between these two things, is treatment. Right? So for treatment considerations, with gender dysphoria, we have affirmation. We allow people to transition, including, but not limited to, surgery and hormones. So for example, I had gender dysphoria about my breasts. I got top surgery, which removed my breasts, and that actually alleviated the gender dysphoria. So we affirm the needs of these people who have gender dysphoria and treat them as, with an alignment with that affirmation. Body dysmorphia, you don't usually actually provide surgery to change those feelings. There's psychotherapy, CBT, cognitive reframing, right? In some extreme cases of body dysmorphia, people want to cut off a part of their body, such as a finger or an arm. But the treatment for body dysmorphia is not actually doing so, right? It's again, psychotherapy, CBT, cognitive reframe. Unfortunately, a lot of people will weaponize body dysmorphia and the treatment considerations for it against those with gender dysphoria. Oh, Schuyler, you just need to cognitively reframe. You just need to accept your body. You just need to think differently. But in reality, we know that doesn't work for many people with gender dysphoria. Maybe it works with some, but the general sort of consensus is that with gender dysphoria, we do actually affirm and treat with that affirmation, whereas body dysmorphia, we don't. And that's why it's so important to see and understand these differences. Okay. Now, kind of a big, I like Venn diagrams, I like images. So this is how I think about body image distortions, a big kind of overarching category underneath that. Body dysmorphia, a smaller version of that and a more extreme version of that perhaps. And then there's also gender dysphoria, and that overlaps with both of these things because gender dysphoria can create body image distortions, can create body dysmorphia with a hyperfixation on certain parts, but it's not altogether exactly the same thing. All right, now, the fact that these are both present when we talk about eating disorders can be quite confusing. Why? Because both of them can contribute, like I said, they're different roots, but both of them can contribute to eating disorder risk. All right, so if you look at the risk factors for eating disorder, according to NEDA, historical trauma, perfectionism, body image dissatisfaction, personal history of anxiety disorder, limited social networks, teasing and bullying, appearance, ideal, internalization, you might notice as I'm sharing these that trans people have heightened risk for all of these things, right? Think about my childhood. I had a limited social network because nobody would play with me because I wasn't girl or boy enough. I had body image dissatisfaction because I didn't fit what I thought I should fit. I felt very perfectionistic because if I didn't present myself exactly in the way that I should, in order to be received the way I wanted to, then it didn't work, right? I definitely had anxiety about how I showed up in the world. I was teased and bullied constantly, right? So a lot of trans people, because of our experiences in the world as trans people, actually have heightened risk for these things. So body image distortions can contribute to eating disorders, but so can gender dysphoria, right? And gender dysphoria, like I said earlier, can contribute to body image distortions, which then goes back to contributing to heightened risk for eating disorders. So it's no sort of coincidence that trans people have a heightened risk of eating disorders, some like 4 times more than the average population. Okay, now from that, it's a perfect sort of shift to Kate and clinical considerations. So go for it.
Thanks so much, Schuyler. And I think so much of exactly what you're talking about is so important for us to hold as providers. So this is just some kind of general overview in terms of, right, why is it so important beyond just affirming people for who they are, for us to consider these issues in the treatment kind of arena. And some of that is due to the prevalence. So based on a study, you see at the bottom, up to 2 to 7% of youth identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. And I would actually estimate that's probably broader than that. Those are the numbers that we're willing to kind of disclose that on a survey. And as much of our research, unfortunately, is conducted on university students, but those university students were reporting much, much higher rates of disordered eating behaviors, up to 4 times more than their cisgender peers. And as we think about some of the things that Schuyler shared about kind of how individuals may try to present as either masculine or feminine and fit into a role, we can imagine that non-binary individuals might be at even greater risk, feeling that like there isn't a model there or a role that is there for them to try and fit into to be accepted, and where some of that bullying could come back in. Of course, much of our treatment has historically focused on and been accessible to cisgender white women. So more recently, it's been great to see, a long time coming, treatment centers open and advertising themselves to all genders. But there's way too many stories out there of people trying to access care and being turned away because they were designated male at birth, or were not presenting in the way that was expected of people with eating disorders. And then one of the real big things that I want to touch on and talk about today is the idea of how eating disorder treatment has historically pushed body acceptance. And there's been, big kind of body positivity for anyone out there on social media, right? There's all these people talking about body positivity and how wonderful that is. And it certainly can be wonderful for people that connect with that idea. But if we think about someone presenting for treatment in a body that does not fit their experience of themselves, feeling like they need to push themselves to love that body or feel positive about that body is really asking something incongruent with who they are. So we'll touch on that a little bit more in a couple minutes, but just to put that out there. And then also a really limited availability of providers with lived experience. I think so many people feel connected, knowing that someone has understanding of their lived experience. And that's part of why I kind of started out today by saying, like, that's not my history. And I think it's really important that people know that, that seeing providers that mirror their experience can be really affirming. Seeing people like Schuyler who are willing to stand up and say, I went through this eating disorder. Here's my recovery story, gives a lot of hope and inspiration. And we can also, kind of have in the back of our minds the things that can contribute to the lack of providers with lived experience, whether that's feeling safe in the field, and the kind of methods that structures and societal structures that are in place, that hoops that people have to jump through in order to get a degree and get licensed and be employed, that are not available to many people in marginalized populations and marginalized bodies. All right, let's hop into the next one, which is a great quote that I found looking through a lot of kind of lived experience journalism for this talk. Which is, if we want to have a better grasp of eating disorders and how they affect people, we need to broaden our understanding of what it means to have a gender and to have a body and the possible futures available to patients after recovery. And so this speaks really, I think, pretty directly to what you were talking about, Schuyler, and how do we, what expectations, what recovery roles are available to people, are being modeled for people. And if someone is seeing a provider that they feel like, okay, the recovery I'm being pushed into means I need to accept my body as it is, that's a real barrier for someone whose internal experience of themselves does not align with the body that they're in. And so how do we open up and broaden our horizons in terms of what does recovery look like, what is out there for people, and how do we support people in determining that path for themselves rather than feeling like they need to fit into some preset mold of what recovery should look like. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so this is kind of my wheelhouse for today, is talking about how do we provide affirming treatment. And I think there's so many levels to this, and I'm sure, you know, there's 100 things I'm leaving out. But we can kind of think of like, what are some of the basic things that we can do to make our space safe for clients to feel like, first of all, if someone's looking for, and I think I saw a question come in, if someone's looking for a treatment center, how might they assess whether this might even be a place that's safe enough for them to call and do an assessment? And of course, we can talk about physical space versus virtual space, but some of kind of the basics, if you do have physical space, or perhaps on your website, having trans inclusive signage, showing trans flags or safe space stickers, and then certainly thinking about your paperwork. And I know lots of people have ongoing conversations about, you know, which EMR is available that can provide affirming treatment, especially when we're considering how do we support clients in accessing insurance benefits when a legal name might be not the name that feels affirming to them. So having gender neutral language, using gender inclusive pronouns, having multiple options in intake paperwork if someone needs to fill something out, so it's not male, female, other, because other is very othering, right? To see yourself reflected in the forms, perhaps using just open text boxes where you can ask a client to describe your gender, describe your gender identity. As Schuyler and I did today, presenting our own pronouns. If you're someone that works in virtual treatment, having your pronouns on your screen, having them in your email signature, constantly introducing yourself, and introducing yourself not just when you think you might be working with a trans client, but setting that as a model for the other providers you work with, for the other people in your life, so that it's normalized. Not asking inappropriate questions, as Schuyler said, right? Most of the time, it's none of our business what's in somebody's pants. Most of the time, that's not going to impact the therapeutic work unless it does, and then the client will bring that to you. Using neutral language, so unless there's a specific reason to be talking about estrogen, referring to hormones, right? Rather than assuming estrogen, because that's, again, reinforcing that the eating disorder space is female centered, focusing on body neutrality rather than body acceptance and positivity. How do we get clients to work towards the idea that the body is a vehicle, right, for us in our lives, and like anything else, we need to take care of it, provide it with the necessary food, water, rest, in order to fully function in the world, rather than kind of pushing for this positivity around something that someone really might not have positive feelings about. Providing ongoing trainings for staff, so making sessions such as this available to your staff, to yourself, seeking additional CEUs and training, not putting yourself out there as someone who specializes in treating diverse populations unless you really have that experience. Making sure you have referrals available to affirming outpatient providers. If you're a therapist seeing a client who needs a PCP, doing some of the footwork to make sure that you have primary care referrals that are going to be affirming, and that all of these different aspects of that practice then are also affirming for your clients. Engaging in ongoing advocacy work. I'm a social worker. Part of my code of ethics is to do ongoing advocacy work really broadly. And so how do we stand up and become positive forces in our circles in the world more broadly? Can we support legislation? Can we support changes to our workplaces that are needed in order to make the space affirming for clients? And we can think about micro, meso, and macro levels of how we might do that advocacy. And then something we've been talking about a lot recently at Within is the potential for really significant trauma that clients come with from previous treatment experiences, and not assuming that clients should feel safe with us when we haven't established that for them. that there's multiple ways that clients have been hurt in treatment previously. And not only do we need to make sure that we're not furthering that trauma, but that we're really providing a space for clients to come and feel comfortable, acknowledge that trauma, and prove that we are a safe space before we expect any of that work to be able to be done. And then kind of the big umbrella for all of this, of course, is holding the client as the expert. We can do all we can do as providers to educate ourselves and provide what we assume is affirming treatment. But if that doesn't land for the client, then it's not affirming, right? So the client can be the expert, let us know what they need. We really can allow them to lead the way in terms of what they need, while at the same time being really careful to not make them responsible for educating us or anyone else. And part of that is our responsibility in doing our own trainings, not providing referrals, for example, for affirming surgery without informed consent of what that requires, right? We don't want to be gatekeepers ever. We want to provide the best care, and that will include needing to do a lot of education at times, and supporting clients in doing their own education and their own research as we provide those really important referrals. And then always, I was just thinking about this as you were talking earlier, Schuyler, always using clients' own language, right? There's lots of terminology that we don't ever want to assume or use because it is historically problematic. And yet there may be some people that feel affirmed with that use of terminology, and then we really want to follow their lead. So making sure that we're always doing that as well. And then kind of keeping in mind, kind of one of the first points I made really is that if we're thinking that, you know, so many youth identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, or non-binary, I don't know about everyone else here today, but I'm not seeing that in represented in our treatment population, right? So knowing that there's so many more people out there that are not able to or are not accessing care for different reasons. And then how do we work, going back to the advocacy point, how do we work to make treatment accessible, make clients aware of their options, do outreach to be able to provide that really important treatment for clients that aren't getting it right now. I'll hand it back over to you, Schuyler.
All right. Thank you so much, Kate. Actually, I'm going to go back one just to make a couple quick notes on what you had said, just to reinforce. I think it's super important to reflect the language that a client has. And I think there sometimes could be space for challenging it, but if you're not trans, it's pretty difficult to do that. I will say, and I just want to share for sort of just thoughts that might be helpful, like because I am trans and I'm not a clinical provider, but I do mentorship and life coaching, and I've seen hundreds of clients, all of which are trans. And I do sometimes challenge, how does that language feel to you? Where did you learn that? You know, what does it mean to you? And sometimes actually we can find that the language that they're using to talk about themselves is limiting, right? The same way that we might challenge it in other ways. And I encourage us to be able to do that, but be really mindful of how you ask those questions, especially if you don't hold the same identities. If you hold the same identities, it's far easier to challenge and say, well, this is my experience, and what about, you know, and kind of bring them into it with you. But if you don't hold it, I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's really important to not invalidate as you do so, and invite the client to think about what they're how they're talking about themselves. But I would only do this if you think that the term might be harmful to them, right? Because there are some times where people use terms that are harmful to themselves, but they're either doing it in a self-demeaning way and they know that, and I think that is worth challenging, or they're doing it in a way that they don't really know. It's kind of like, how do I say, like, let's say a client says, well, I'm a transgender man, I'm not a real man. I would challenge that, but the way we go about doing it, I think, is important, right? So hopefully that sort of makes sense. And I think that last one that you put, Kate, holding the client as expert but not responsible for educating others, is absolutely key, right? If you could take one thing away, it would be that, because I think this is actually the case with a lot of people. We have to trust that people know themselves best, right? And that they're going to present us what they know about themselves, and they need guidance. That's why they're there, right? And seeking help. But it doesn't mean that they don't know themselves, right? And that they haven't known themselves for a long time. And I think remembering that's really, really important, while also like the second part that says not forcing them to then, if they know themselves, well, great, tell everybody, right? I think that can be very difficult. We're going to get into that in the Q&A for a second, but all right, wonderful. So how do we deal with a client who's unsure of their gender? We're going to go through a couple Q&As, and then we're going to open it up for you all, because then we'll probably have a good half an hour for questions, which is exactly what I wanted. So how do we deal with a client who is unsure of their gender and their pronouns? What should I call them? So this is almost always a question I get when I present with professionals, especially with mental health providers. And I think the shortest way that I answer this question is it's really important to ask the person what works for them. Right. So I have a lot of clients that say, well, I don't really know what my pronouns are yet. I'm still trying to figure that out. I'm like wavering between this, that, and the other. And so then I create a conversation about that. How is that going for you? What does that feel like? Is there a pronoun that does feel good, but you're scared to say that it feels good, right? And we can create space to talk about it. Sometimes they're not ready for that, and that's okay. But I think making space over time for that conversation is really, really important. I have a lot of people that would prefer to be called they, them pronouns, for example, but will present a she/they because they're not ready to say, this is who I am, right? There are also people who will use they, them pronouns, but want a different binary pronoun. For example, like let's say that, when I used to be referred to as she, her, then let's say I did they, them, and that they, them could be what I need, right? But it could also have been, I'm afraid to ask for he, him, right? And I'm just giving examples. So none of these things, there is not like, I don't want you to shove anybody into boxes, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I think it's important to explore that with the client if they are able to do so with you. It also might be about coming up with ideas. So I say, okay, great. Well, for now, why don't I just call you your name? And then you don't have to be called a pronoun, and I don't have to misgender you in any way. And when you're ready, and when we kind of come to a place where you feel more comfortable saying this pronoun works, or you want to experiment with this pronoun, great, we'll do that. Sometimes it says, let me just avoid pronouns altogether. Do you want to try a pronoun this day and a different pronoun next session? I've tried that with people too, where I experiment. I know in my experience, it was really helpful when I was going through my sort of beginnings of gender exploration. If any of you are in Miami, I went to a place called the Yes Institute, which is a gender sort of education advocacy organization. And I walked in and I was presenting like I had been presenting for a couple of years at that point, mostly as a woman, right? Long hair and girls' clothes. And I walked in and the guy who was working, they said, what pronouns do you want me to call you? And I was like, oh my God, I don't know. I mean, I want he, him, but I don't like, I felt I couldn't ask for that. And he said, do you want me to try he, him? And I said, yeah, I'd like that. And so for the rest of the day, he called me he, him pronouns. I had never had that experience in that way before, but it was such a beautiful way for me to say, hey, how does this feel to me? Does this feel right? Do I like it? And it was with my consent that we did that, right? So I think we can ask and sort of invite the client into that journey together, while also taking into account what Kate said, that client might have trauma about pronouns. They might not be ready to offer them to you because they might not think that you'll use them. So the most important part is if the client says, this is what I would like to be called, call them that. If you make a mistake, apologize, recognize it, apologize, and then move on. Don't make a big deal out of it unless the client wants to talk about it. But I think it's really important to make sure that you're calling the client the right pronouns that they do ask for. Because if you make space to ask them for what their pronouns are, and then you don't call them that can be extremely hard, traumatic, feel like betrayal, feel like, a massive disruption of trust, right? I said this before in these kinds of, as I explain these kinds of things, and it seems to help people understand when a trans person is misgendered, generally speaking, it can be very painful. But when we are misgendered by a provider, it can sort of triple, exponentially increase the pain. So I remember when I first started going to therapy after OPC, after my residential treatment, I was here in Boston, where I went to college, and my provider at the time, my therapist, called me ma'am, and we should say yes ma'am, or refer to me with she, her pronouns a couple times, and the way it sort of can spiral in one's head. For me, it went from, okay, she's calling me the wrong pronoun, she doesn't see who I am. If she doesn't see who I am and she's a provider, then I really am not who I say I am, and then maybe I'm crazy, then maybe I shouldn't be here. Okay, maybe I shouldn't be here. And that happens within a couple seconds. And I'm not unique. That is something that I've heard from pretty much every other trans person I've talked to in these scenarios. It can spiral very quickly to, I don't want to be here anymore. And I want you to take that with a lot of sincerity and severity, understanding that using the wrong pronouns from a place of power, which is kind of what we're in if you're a provider, right, can really deeply impact somebody's self-esteem and ability to know oneself, because trans people are constantly gaslit by the rest of the world. You're not who you say you are, Schuyler. You're not a real man. You don't actually know who you are. You're just a messed up woman. These are all things I've been told multiple times, repeatedly, to the point now I'm quite immune to them. But at the beginning of my transition, that made me feel crazy. It made me feel so much like I didn't know myself, like I wasn't my own expert. And so what I'm trying to sort of hit home as we're interacting with a client who doesn't know their pronouns, or who does and is not ready to share them, or who doesn't know exactly how to ask for them because of previous trauma, what have you, it is super important to understand the gravity of gendering them correctly. Now, everybody makes mistakes, and I firmly believe that it's okay to a degree if you make a mistake, but you have to remedy it and you have to improve your behavior. If you are consistently misgendering somebody, then it's really time to go home and do some journaling, some introspection, some unpacking of your own gender stereotypes to consider, why am I not calling this person the right pronouns? Why am I struggling so much to respect this person for who they are, right? And you might find some deep stuff there, because we're all in a very transphobic world. We all grow up in a very gendered society. We gender colors, we gender so many things that are unnecessarily gendered. So of course you have these biases, but it's your responsibility to unpack those on your own, not with your client. All right, I see.
Can I jump in with one more thought, Schuyler? Thank you. Because I was also thinking, as you were talking, if you're someone that's working with transgender youth, or really any youth, because that's identity development time, to be clear about what their name is that you use with them, what their pronouns are when you are with them. And if you need to be communicating with family members or other people outside of your work with them, what name and pronouns they feel safe with in that disclosure. So just to keep that in mind as well.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's an excellent addition. It is so important not to out kids if you can prevent it. So definitely making sure you know what pronouns they use outside of the space. If you're in a group, they might be a different group pronouns in different group settings. So that's excellent. Thank you, Kate. All right, we're gonna do one more pre-prepared question and then we'll open it up for you all. Okay, we're good on time. Okay, this one this was a really big sort of like passion of mine. Okay, well, all of this I'm passionate about. But what should I do if a client calls me transphobic or calls me homophobic? All right, this is something that I've gotten before, that people have asked me, that I know has created tension in many different locations before, whether that be a clinical, medical, school, or professional environment. Okay. So most people, when they're called transphobic, homophobic, racist, sexist, whatever, we can go on with the list of things that people can be. A lot of people's first response is defensiveness. No, I'm not. No, I didn't mean it, right? Especially, let's assume everybody here, you're here listening. You're a good person. You care about trans people, or at least you want to learn about us. And that's awesome. We're starting from a great place. So your first response to being called transphobic, homophobic, and so on might be to say, no, you didn't understand me correctly. No, I didn't mean it like that. No, let me explain, right? The problem when we do that, though it might be completely valid that that's what you didn't mean or that you didn't say or what have you, is that you immediately negate the experience of the other person. You immediately say, my necessity to explain myself is more important than your communicating of pain. And that is a very harmful thing to do, especially if you're in a provider scenario, right? Where actually you need to hear the other person's experience. So the first thing that somebody, in my opinion, should do when told, or I'm going to say when called in, despite, how exactly it's done, when called in as transphobic or homophobic, to say, okay, I'm going to listen. It's really about pausing in that moment, because your defensiveness, your emotions, your pain, your anger at being called these things, that's valid. Those emotions are all valid, but actions that stem from those emotions probably might not be, right? So that's important to pause, collect yourself, right? Then it's really to listen to what the person has to say. They might be angry. They might be attacking. They might not say all the nicest things in that moment, but it's still really important, in my opinion, in these moments, especially if you're not trans, to try to distill what is the message, what is the pain that's being communicated to me, what happened for this person, not what did I do necessarily, that's part of it, but more, what is the pain that this person's experiencing and how can I really be empathetic to that? Oh, I understand you're hurting. right? How can you get to that place? Then it's about reflecting. What did you do that impacted that? If the person hasn't directly told you, it's trying to think about what did you do that could have impacted that feeling or resulted in that feeling, regardless of your intent. And that's really, really key, right? It doesn't really matter what your intent was if the impact happened. It happened. Then it's about actually saying, okay, I hear you, and responding to the person. I understand X, Y, and Z. I'm sorry that I did X, Y, and Z, or I'm sorry for how my actions impacted you. I understand. I'm going to take that forwards. I think this is like a classic sort of like lesson on apologies, but it's not about saying, but, right? It's not, I'm sorry, but you didn't understand me correctly. That's called gaslighting, right? You're trying to tell this person what their experience is. It's not, I'm sorry, but that's not valid, right? It's really making space for that person's experience. Now, I think there are times when providers are called transphobic, and it is an act of anger and not an act of sort of valid transphobia, if you will, like it's not actually transphobia. Even still in those spaces, I think it's important to make space for those emotions because we'll learn a lot as we do. And we'll learn a lot about that person and what they need as we do, and then it can come forwards in a clinical sense. And I'm not a clinician, so maybe Kate can say more about that part specifically. But I think it's really about making space to listen. And it's really not about saying, no, I'm not transphobic. If you're not a trans person, that should never come out of your mouth. Because if you're not transphobic, you're going to listen and you're going to try to remedy whatever happened. You're not going to try to tell somebody else what their experience is, right? In the same way, I can never tell a Black person what is or isn't anti-Black. It's not my experience. I can't do that, right? Somebody else can't tell me what is or isn't anti-Asian if they're not Asian, because that's not their experience. So we need to hold the people who are marginalized in these ways as experts in their experience, and then also understanding that emotions are complicated, right? Kate, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
No, I think it's perfect. And to me, it goes back to kind of the fundamentals of validation and affirming someone's experience, right? Whether or not we intended harm, and for most of us, I think we don't intend harm ever, right? Harm happened. And so then how do we do the repair? How do we validate the client's experience? And then, as you said, go back and reflect for ourselves, what might have happened, what might have contributed to this. Best of intentions aside, how do I improve going forward? And I think that's, like you said, why everyone's here today, in order to be an affirming provider. And it is really hard work, and it's really uncomfortable work. And certainly I make mistakes all the time. Just because I'm up here presenting today doesn't mean I don't make mistakes. So it really is about saying, I'm sorry, what was your experience? If someone is open to it, how can I make it better? And then moving on and doing the education for yourself.
I love it. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kate. All right. I'm going to open it up now for you all's questions. So I'm going to exit the screen share because you know that it's time for questions now that I've said it. And the way that this will work is, if you have questions, you can either use the raise hand function and we can call on you and ask you. You can ask it live if you feel like it. You can also input it into the chat. I do know we have a couple already, so I think we'll start with that, but I just would like to tell you that there's many different ways you can ask it. I have one that's come to me directly, so I'm going to answer that one first, but I just want to encourage anybody to ask questions however they like. And the thing I'll actually add right before and now open it up for you. You can ask any question you'd like. I think a lot of people sort of tiptoe around trans people, especially. They think we're going to break or combust or bite you or something. I promise I'm not going to do any of those things. I truly mean it when I say you can ask me anything. I've given presentations to a lot of different kinds of people, including kindergartners. And the kindergarten presentation, honestly, is very similar to the ones that I give you all. We don't do the gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia stuff, but all the beginning stuff is pretty the same. And I'll tell you, kindergartners, if in case you don't work with them or have one or remember being one, they have no filter. No filter at all. So today, as we walk into this Q&A, I encourage you to have no filter, to ask the questions you're truly curious about, because if you have it, I bet somebody else does too. And it's important that we get to those questions. I'm not going to be offended or upset or anything by the questions you've had. I promise I've been asked it before. And if the question is offensive, we'll talk about it. And I'll explain to you why maybe you don't want to ask it elsewhere, but that it's okay for you to ask here, because I'll probably also answer it and we'll walk through it together. So truly, ask whatever you'd like, and ask it either through the chat directly to me. You can ask it to Jamie, you can ask it to Kate, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you live. So right now I'm going to answer the one that's in the chat, and then we'll go from there. So somebody has asked me, how do you recommend educating parents who struggle to differentiate body dysmorphia from gender dysphoria and refuse to allow teens to do things as cutting their hair, wearing a binder, because they feel it's, quote, just a phase, and struggle to understand the importance of gender affirmation? So there's a follow-up, but I'm going to start there. So the first thing to recognize is that when kids are doing things, I want everybody to really consider this. When kids are doing things that are about self-exploration that do not have any long-term impact or really any impact at all negatively on them, why not? Right? Cutting their hair or allowing them to wear a binder, neither of these have long-term health effects, and both of them are quite reversible. The binder is very simple. You just take it off. The haircut might take a little bit more time, depending on if they're growing or cutting it, but that's also just a haircut. And I think it's really important to recognize for parents that the risks that they're running, they always ask, well, what if I affirm transness and they don't end up being trans and they regret it? First of all, that's incredibly rare. All the research supports that is very, very rare. When people say I'm trans and they're not, in the end, that almost never happens. Some like 2.5% on the most recent study I ended up identifying as cisgender, whereas 97.5% ended up identifying over a 5-year period still as trans. All right, so it's very rare for somebody to revert back to identifying as cisgender. So it's rare that regret happens. But even if it does, in this case, cutting their hair, binder, no long-term effects. People always fail to ask the second question: what if I reject my kid and they are right? Okay, in that scenario, way far more important question, okay, because that's actually much more likely to happen. If you reject your kid and they are right about their transness, you actually directly increase their risk of suicidality, depression, anxiety, and self-harm behaviors. And we have research to support that, not just one, but several studies. So the risk that we're running is pretty much no risk on providing affirmation and a lot of risk, right? Suicidality being one of them, on not providing gender affirmation. Right before the age of 10 or 12, gender affirmation, there's nothing permanent about it as well. And people often forget that. They think that if they affirm their kid, they're going to have, genital surgery at age 6. That never happens. Never. Most gender affirmation for kids below the age of 10 to 12 has nothing to do with their physical body, except for, like I said, maybe a haircut. Even after 10 to 12, it's puberty blockers, which are reversible and safe and have been used on cisgender kids for decades, right? And even at hormones, there's very, very, very few % of people who take hormones and regret it. So I think it's important to inform the parents of these facts. Most parents don't know them. They don't at all. And I think what I always ask parents when I'm talking to them is I'm like, I will literally ask them as directly as possible, do you want your kid to be around in 5 years? Do you? Do you want to take them to the hospital for a suicide attempt? Is that something you're willing to do? Because it's that, or give them a haircut. And parents need to assess this risk in that way. And I am that direct with them. And I encourage you all to be some sort of similar version of that directness. So another way to say that is it really doesn't matter if it's body dysmorphia in that sense or gender dysphoria. It's important to let them explore who they are. And that is so much more important for anything than restricting them. In a recent study, actually, by Christina Olson at the Trans Youth Project, they found actually that of the 7% that retransition, so 97% end up being trans, but about 7% of them kind of go back and forth. Only 2% of them end up deciding that they identify as cisgender. But of those people that had retransitioned, there was a very low rate of any distress, which is to say that even when the child says, oops, that isn't me, I'm going to go back to identifying as this other gender, it doesn't present distress for them if they're in an accepting and supportive environment. And that's also really key. It's about affirmation. It's actually not about gender in the end of it. Kate, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd love to. I am actually a very proud parent of a gender nonconforming kiddo, and so have some like lovely anecdotal information, right? In the same way that you said, right, kindergartners have no filter and will ask you anything. They're also very accepting. So we hear from extended family members like really, really offensive things, like how could you wear a dress? And he does use he, him pronouns, but right, how could you let this happen? All these terrible things will happen, really. And then what happens is he says, don't I look pretty? Goes to school. Nobody bats an eye. Or somebody might say dresses are for girls. And he says, oh no, actually, I really like it. It's pretty, it's comfortable. And that's the end of it. So I think as adults, we conflate so much and expect so much based on our experiences and our biases, when kids are actually really accepting of one another in many cases, not to put off like the horrible bullying that can happen, but especially at the younger ages, right? The difference between him crying and saying like, why doesn't Grammy want me to wear a dress, versus Lily and I both match wearing our unicorn dresses today, right? It's just incredible to see. So also I think to support parents and finding their own way to challenge some of those biases, get support for themselves, find other parents that are in a similar situation, so that they're not kind of working out our own stuff on our kids.
Yeah, I think that's key, Kate, because what you're really saying is, let's not give the kids our fear. Right? Let's give them our support instead. And it's okay to be afraid. A lot of parents, at least all the ones that I've worked with that are, that want to restrict their kids' ability to express themselves or explore gender, they're doing it from a place of fear, which is actually another iteration of love. It says, I'm afraid that you're going to be hurt and I love you and I don't want that to happen. So I have a lot of empathy for these parents, and I encourage you to do so as well. But that empathy needs to be sort of like used, right? To have them guided in a way that says, listen, you are feeling afraid, and you can encourage them, like you said, Kate, to get those resources. There's a place called PFLAG, which has national chapters all over the country. PFLAG used to stand for Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. It no longer does, because we are more than lesbians and gays. But PFLAG is still a resource for parents and friends of LGBTQ plus people and kids. And so I encourage parents always, when they're struggling, to go to those places, because a lot of parents have a lot of feelings about their kids coming out as trans or doing anything that's not gender conforming, right? Because the world is scary, and it makes a lot of sense that they feel that way. But when we put that on that kid, when we give them our fear, that isn't very kind to that kid. And I've seen so many fearless, beautiful, amazing trans young people, gender nonconforming young people, who are honestly almost carefree to an extent, because they don't see the world in this really bound, limited way. And as soon as they start to, that to me is that's so sad, when they start to see it as limiting, because we are putting limitations on them. And I think that's where the school system needs to change, but that's another rant for another time. Okay, somebody wanted to raise their hand, and then we'll keep going back to the chat. So Patricia, I believe you had a question, so go for it.
I think they might have had to step off.
Yeah, I think she had to hop off.
Okay, I still see her square. That's why okay, cool.
We have another comment in the chat from Lacey.
Okay, let me.
Lacey, if you want to unmute, or I can read it, whichever.
Yeah.
Prefer.
First of all, thank you guys for being here. You guys have been wonderful. So personal rather than professional question. I'm queer, and my partner's direct family has some very ignorant views towards the LGBTQ community, though he himself has been nothing but affirming and supportive and amazing. And while they've never said anything hateful towards me, I'm worried how they may act towards my son. While he's only 7 months old, I plan on raising him free to express his gender identity however he pleases, and I want to affirm him every step of the way. Do you guys have any suggestions on how to speak to my son about bullying or rude comments from family members or anyone if that does happen?
Kate, do you want to take this one first, and then I can piggyback?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think providing the affirming environment that you are doing is just the biggest foundation you can possibly give. With my son, we did a lot of picture books. There's some really great ones. Worm Loves Worm, Neither, the Marlon Bundo book, right? Like a broad range. And also books that have nothing to do with sexuality or gender, that just happen to have then that representation in the books. I think there's a picture book, Marla Frazee did, Babies, that has a lot of same-sex couples, and actually got banned some places because of just the illustrations of same-sex couples taking care of babies. The story has nothing to do with it. So providing that representation. And then as the kids get older, talking about like, what do you say? Right, the same way we would with really any kid. How do you stand up for yourself? Who are your safe people? And, if it's at school, if it's at soccer, who do you go to if you have a problem? And then always, building that foundation that you have of the loving, trusting relationship that they feel like they can come back and tell you if something's going wrong, making that space to talk about your day And then if you can do education for the extended family, which is always hard and can be tricky in family dynamics, but having those conversations where you can, and then having the safe space to come back to, because you're that kiddo's home base.
I second all those things. And I'll also add that one of my favorite quotes that my dad actually said to me once, he said, "Schuyler, love isn't just a feeling, love protects." And I think that it's really important for a parent to remember that love also protects, which sometimes means rupturing relationships that you might have in order to protect your child. That's a personal belief of mine. I don't think that I'm telling you have to necessarily do that, but that's a belief, an encouragement, an invitation that I offer parents, especially because I have interacted with so many trans young people who say my parent won't protect me, and it breaks my heart, and it will break their heart for years to come. I work with, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, sometimes older than that. And the fact that their parents didn't create a space of protectiveness for them, not just love, because people say, my parents love me, but, right, X, Y, and Z. And when we don't create a space that also protects that child, especially when they are young, that doesn't communicate love. That communicates, I am more afraid of other people's reactions than I am of standing up for you. That means I prioritize other people's interactions, right? Other people's judgments, other people's opinions over your safety. So I think it's really key to remember that love protects. And I think it is a parent's, honestly, one of their sole duties for a young person, right? A young child is to protect that child. And sometimes that means a lot of loss for the parent if the relationships that they hold are detrimental to the child. So I think then the second part of that, as an empathetic person, is also to say, okay, you also need to then grieve those relationships and find ways for you to move on for it. Because I also know parents who do create those boundaries, but then blame the child for them. And that's also a no-no, right? So I think it's about creating a safe way for yourself, not you specifically, Lacey, but anybody, right, struggling through this, to also grieve appropriately those relationships that might be ruptured due to needing to protect your child or creating a safe environment for your child. But thank you for that question. It's a good one. Okay.
Looks like Stephanie had a question. How does someone work on gender dysphoria? Can it get better? Does it ever not get better?
Okay, so the reason I'm it's a great question. The reason I'm hesitating is because I think, like most things, people have individual experiences, and I don't think I can give an answer that would fit everybody. Gender affirmation through surgeries and hormones, when desired by the individual, have been shown to have a pretty high success rate. So there's a very low rate of regret of surgery and hormones, and I can point you to resources if you or research about that. But that's sort of a general consensus within the community about medical, psychiatric, psychological community for trans people and trans healthcare. So that's a resource, but there are people that don't want to transition. There are people that they don't have access to it because of financial reasons, or because of constraints from family, or because they might be minors and they might live in a state where it's a literal crime to provide gender affirming healthcare, like in Arkansas. So there are many different ways that people can work through gender affirmation. I think there are ways to, quote, work on it, and I would say sort of in like a psychotherapy way. And I've seen success in actually a method that I've developed for. It's not technically clinical, again, because I'm not a clinician, but in a life coaching scenario where I've worked with people on how to have, actually, it's what Kate's talking about, have body neutrality, right? Instead of body acceptance. And I think that's the key sort of take home about that, is that it's not about saying you need to accept your body, everything's fine. Schuyler, just accept your breasts, just accept that your body feels misaligned with you. And it's, love your body, it's body positivity, right? But it's more like just saying, this is how it is. I guess, sorry, I meant to say don't have body positivity, have body acceptance, right? Just saying this is where it is right now, right? And I've found that to be really powerful. My hesitation recommending that all of you necessarily implement exactly the way I've done it is because not all of you are trans. If you're not trans, it can be really hard to encourage a trans individual to, quote, work on their gender dysphoria, especially coming from an eating disorder lens, because it very much feels like, oh, just work on it and you'll love your body more. Right. And And I went through that. A lot of providers were like, Schuyler, you just need to love your body more. I even had providers who completely dismissed that I was trans. They said, this is just a phase for you. And you're just going through this because you have an eating disorder. And so we're just going to work on you accepting your body, because most women don't like their breasts or the hips or what have you if they have an eating disorder. And I was like, this is not the same thing. But I didn't have people that trusted me, right, in that way. And part of it, to give credit to those providers, is the literature also was different 10 years ago. And the suggestions of the guidelines were different then as well. And so I didn't have the affirmation that I needed. So I hope that sort of answers the question.
Can I just say a little bit of a follow-up? So like in the situation of like a young person, 16, who is transgender and wants to have gender affirming surgery in the future, but all these people that like right now, it is what it is. And in the future, we feel like maybe the gender affirming surgery will be what it takes
to
resolve. But right now, active eating disorder behaviors, and maybe largely because of the gender dysphoria, until that gets resolved.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know what my question really is. I mean, with anything else, when we try to help someone with an eating disorder, we might do a lot of stuff about like, well, you know, maybe we would talk about this behavior won't really fix this problem.
Right.
But like, maybe it does.
Yeah.
In a way.
So I will share a couple of sort of anecdotal pieces, and I would love there to be more research on this, and hopefully there will be soon. But a couple anecdotal pieces of feedback. The first is that I know people who had eating disorders or presented with eating disorder behavior for some period of time, had access to transition, and the eating disorder behaviors disappeared. And it is sometimes that simple. It is rare, because a lot of times trans people also have a lot of other kinds of compounding, co-occurring trauma and mental health issues. And so it's not just that. I know for me, it's very unlikely that transition was the only thing that helped me walk through my eating disorder. I think my eating disorder is rooted in a lot of parents' issues, a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, a lot of childhood stuff. So for me, transition would not have like rid me of my eating disorder. But there are people, and I have friends that are intimate friends, good friends of mine, who I've watched go through it. You know, they have very disordered eating and very poor self-image. They transition and they're great. They don't even need therapy, some of them. I don't think that's common. I think it's possible. I think for most people, there's more worked in there, even if the eating disorder started as a method for mitigating gender dysphoria. Oftentimes, eating disorders can compound and become other things and become, you know, the thing that people deal with everything with. So I would say I don't hear like a direct question with what you're saying, but in the situation that you're describing, I think there's a combination of things to be done. One, if I was working with that client as a mentee, I would say, you're going to get the things that you want to one day, right? You're going to get, if you want top surgery, you're going to get it one day. I have faith in you for that. And there's actually a bit of just like reassurance that you're going to get to the place you want to get to. And that can be really important. And then the question is, what do we do in the meantime? Because you have this meantime, we don't know exactly how long it's going to be, but how do you want to spend that? What do you want to live your life as in that meantime? Do you want to sort of waste away with this eating disorder? Do you want to spending your time with your eating disorder, or do you want to do something else with that time? And leading into the conversation in that way, and then that can morph into, okay, if you don't, which is hopefully where you get to, that this person doesn't want to live with their eating disorder, because most people, well, that's complicated. Some people hang on to it, of course, as we know. But there might be space to say, how can we get to a place of okay enoughness and acceptance, neutrality enoughness, that we're able to live a little bit more sustainably in the meantime, right? What I always tell people, and I like this imagery a lot, is when I decided I was going to have top surgery, that didn't mean that everything disappeared, but it gave me this peace, because I thought, I'm going to get there. And in this interim period, I'm not going to love my breasts. I'm not going to wake up one day and be like, I'm fine. But I am going to remember that I have a light at the end of the tunnel. And in the meantime, I could spend this whole time fighting my body as much as I possibly could. But is that going to make me happy? Probably not, because I've been doing it for a long time and it's not gotten me anywhere, right? Or I could put the weapons down and say, this is still a problem. but it's going to be dealt with in X amount of months, years, whatever. And dealing with it now is not actually the best way to kind of go through it. So those are the thoughts. It's hard. It's very hard to do. It's why I also offer the mentorship, because I think sometimes talking to somebody who's been through it before can be really helpful to the client as well. So I recommend that in addition to that. Cool. I think we probably have time for one more question.
Yes, we do. We have one in the chat from Daniel. Daniel, do you want to come off mute, or you want me to do it?
I can. I was just asking. I know in the past, by the way, amazing presentation, amazing topic. Thank you so much for being here, both of you. This is incredible. And I hope more people are talking about this more often. But the question that I had was, I know that in the past, or kind of in present, two good resources is the gingerbread person and then the gender unicorn, to help kind of educate people, families, about the different language and different distinctions between the verbiage that they can use to help be more gender affirming. I wasn't sure if you still thought this is kind of like gold standard, if you had other resources people could use, and your thoughts, but thank you.
Yeah, well, just so everybody knows what we're talking about, I put the link in the chat. To be honest, it's been a while since I've heard somebody throwing around the genderbread person. I think in 2016 or 17, it was all the rage. Everybody's talking about the genderbread person. I don't think it's bad. I actually just pulled it up to remind myself because it changes too. It's where apparently they're on version 4.0. I think that it is sort of generally good, but I'm sure that you would find people who would disagree with its sort of ideology. But I think generally speaking, it's fine. I don't know if I would say that it's considered the gold standard anymore. I also think that we're moving, at least my understanding of a lot of my community, sort of trans, expansive, educational community, if you will, is also moving to understanding that gender is so much more complicated and simple than we understand it to be now. And what I'll say, I cannot possibly say this in the next 3 minutes, but essentially the long story short is that the gender binary that we know today, so the concept of male and female that we know today, actually comes from a lot of systems of oppression over the years, right? It's about oppressing people into a role that could then have somebody have power over, right? And a lot of that comes actually out of Eurocolonialism. Okay, it comes out of the mass amount of colonization from white Europeans around the world that eradicated certain cultures where there were plenty of gender diversity beforehand, right? And people who were trans people, and they weren't even called trans, they were just people just had different genders, right? So there's so much more there that even I'm just learning about. And that's why I think the genderbread person, in theory, is still quite good. I don't think it's wrong necessarily, but it also depends on this binary concept of gender, because if you open it, everything is still pink and blue, right? So I think that would be my issue with it, Daniel, but I don't think it's bad. I just think there's so much more nuance that we can't possibly put into a graphic. Cool. I'm going to say one other thing, and then we'll wrap. I just was remembering from a different question. One of the biggest questions that we get as trans people is, what if it's just a phase? Okay. And my answer to that is, so what if it is? There are a lot of phases we go through in life. There's a lot of different things that we change about ourselves. There are a lot of life-altering decisions that parents make for their children that we never see massive political campaigns or entire countries coming out against. For example, what classes somebody chooses, what sports people get put in. If I wasn't put in swimming as a kid, my life would not be at all what it looks like today. Okay, what about the fact that my parents decided to have a brother? They didn't decide to have the brother part, but another child, right? That's a whole thing that they decided for me. That was a life-altering decision for me to have another child that I grew up with, okay? There are so many things that we either consent to or don't consent to as children that are life-altering decisions, but some reason when it's about cutting hair or wearing clothes from a different gendered section of the store, which is really, if you think about it, just a different cut of cotton or whatever other material, those are the things that people panic about. Why? Because they've been told to panic about it. Because the systems of oppression in the country and in the world are telling us to panic about these things because it's going to unravel society. Okay, that's called moral panic. And that's being instilled in us by the media. And I want to tell you this because we cannot miss this factor of systemic oppression, as I was naming as an additional factor that trans people must go through as a part of therapy. When I have providers that don't understand the systemic oppression that we're experiencing, it's a very flat experience with that provider. There's a lot more that goes into this oppression that we're experiencing and trying to force not only trans people to not be themselves, but cis people to be afraid of gender exploration. right? And guess what? You all, if you're cis, you also need gender exploration. It is important for you to understand your gender too. It's a great quote that's kind of anonymous because I don't know who said it, and it's floated around the trans community for a while, but it's, if you're going to be cis, do it on purpose. What does that mean? Bring intention to who you are, bring intention to how you show up in your gender and how your gender and what your gender means to you. If you didn't get your question answered from me, I encourage you to check out, we'll remind this first, eating disorders don't discriminate, so treatment shouldn't either. But I encourage you to check out my resource called Lane Changer. So I have actually an online learning platform where, and everybody at Within Health has access to this, but I would encourage you, if you're not from Within Health, to also check this out. It has 40 plus Q&A modules ranging from 30 seconds to just a few minutes in length. So they're all very digestible. The whole training, if you take all of them, takes about an hour and a half. So it's very digestible, but this is a way for you to learn more about trans experiences. And this will definitely help you be a better provider to the trans people who really, really need the care. We are not well represented, not in providership, not in medical providership, not in mental health, but we are massively overrepresented in patients. We need, or rather in the struggle, but not being patients. We need more care. And in order to do that, you have to understand us a little bit more. So if you didn't get your question answered, there's a ton more here, all about gender-affirming healthcare for children, trans people in sports, which is a hot topic, of course. What about detransition, allyship coming out, and so much more. So I encourage you to visit lanechanger.com for more about that. Another Lane Changer slide, and these are Kate's resources as well. Okay, I think that's all. We're over time, or no, perfectly at time. Excellent. Kate, please, anything else? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much to Schuyler for sharing your story. And just a reminder, like, there's so many more resources out there. Please continue to educate yourself. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Schuyler or myself. We're happy to help point you in the right direction.
Thank you so much to both of you, Kate and Schuyler. This was an amazing presentation with lots of information for our attendees. We thank you as well for sharing this time and space with us. And I hope that you all continue to attend our CE sessions along with our media track. And thank you so much. Don't forget to check your dashboard, and I will see you in the next session. Thank you. Have a good day.